So just to fill you in on some of the facts that you might not recall, Sheila Salter was murdered in December of 1995. Peter Bright Eyes was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison. He was shipped off to the Everton Institution, the Max, to serve his sentence. And after one day out there, he was found hanging by the neck by his own shoelaces. So Sarah Salter Kelly says to me, when I came into a place of forgiveness with Peter Bright Eyes, my intention wasn't necessarily forgiveness at the time. My intent was to create a ceremony and sit with him. I knew at the 10-year mark that I needed to talk to him. I didn't know any other way to talk to him aside from sitting down and creating sacred space and having a conversation. A little bit like what we did in the prison to visit prisoners, but again, very different. So my plan was to have a conversation in my own prayer and ego at the time, make sure that the powers that be knew what he did. I needed to articulate it myself. That was part of my own healing process. Sarah seems to know that I haven't had much experience sitting down and talking to dead people. So she switches into teacher mode. There's something called journeying, which is similar to when someone's led on a meditation. But when you get used to it, you just go on your own. She tells me she had some of these journeys when she saw him for who he is, separate from who he was in this lifetime. She adds, if that makes any sense, or who he is aside from the actions he chose to take in this lifetime. She says she recognized he wasn't really any different from her, just that he made really crappy choices. She says she realized she was in a place where she judged him, was angry with him, frustrated and hurt by him, and that kept her bound to him. When she learned to see who he was, she says, she found compassion and forgiveness, and that shifted the energy in her relationship with him. She looks at me again and says, I think this happens to anybody who goes through trauma. It could be childhood trauma. It could be somebody did something nasty to you on the playground. When you feel that in your gut or in your body, and you carry that into adulthood, you're energetically bound to that person until you learn how to release it. She says, if there's anything you have a hard time talking about, something that feels raw and upsets you when you do discuss it, you're not free. And I hate not being free. I don't like being bound by anything at any time. Once I realized it was up to me, she says, to change that. Once I remembered, I started actively pursuing it. She tells me how her working to release herself from Peter Bright Eyes got her involved in the Inca medicine wheel, and how she ended up not merely forgiving him, but actually loving him. I expect she senses I'm deeply shocked, even though I'm trying my best to hide it. She laughs and admits, this is crazy shit. Fruity stuff. Flaky. She says that in 2006, she created a ceremony with Peter Bright Eyes and spent about 8 months with it. She set up an altar and prayed before each direction, sat in each direction, focused on what each direction meant to her, centered herself, talked to Peter about how she felt about what happened to her mother. She said it was a lot like what psychologists suggest people do to work through grief. Write to the dead person, put raw emotion on the page, and work through it bit by bit. After 2 months of calling on Peter's spirit and talking to him, she says, he actually showed up. I would drum and sing and just lie down or sit. I let myself be guided to where I needed to go, Sarah says. I was sitting on this sand wall in my vision. I was holding onto this young boy and talking to him. He was telling me he was really worried about something he had to take responsibility for. I was encouraging him to do what he needed to do. Suddenly, she saw that she was the mom and Peter was her son. She felt an overwhelming sense of love and compassion for him. And she was disgusted with what she saw and felt. So she pulled herself out of the vision and went into a cursing rant. None of it made any sense to her. Still, she pushed herself, continued the process for 6 more months, because she knew she had to work through this somehow, even though she didn't understand it. She took some advice from one of her mentors and finally conducted a fire ceremony to release Peter under the full moon in November 2006. For nearly a year, she says, she didn't see Peter again. But then he came to warn her about a man and a course she was taking. She told Peter to go away and said, "We're done. We don't need to talk to each other anymore." But he was persistent, and she realized that this and other warnings from him were always dead on. As we're talking, a large raven circles her yard just beyond the porch. Sarah says, "That raven's been around all day, especially this morning, around the hill and some of the trees." I ask her if the raven means something special to her. "Yeah," she says. "The raven is deeply connected with my work with Peter. Raven medicine is about learning to go into the shadows and bring the medicine of the shadow into the light." She says she's not surprised to see it appear while we talk about Peter and her mother's murder. She tells me her relationship with Peter Bright Eyes led her to connect with Aboriginal issues, to try to understand the impact of residential schools, colonization, and reserves. She tells me that just this year, she spent a day with a former chief at Saddle Lake, where Peter was born. She says she talked to Peter's sister, and in February, went to Saddle Lake to do a presentation as part of a residential school's healing process. I had a number of other pieces I could have chosen, some other pieces I wanted to read too, but it seemed to me, in the context of what's been happening across the country this week, that this was a piece to read. So thank you so much for listening, and I look so much forward to what Naomi's got to say.